So let's get a couple of voices on this. Bob Bull is chairman of the Alliance of British Drivers, and Donnachadh McCarthy, regular with us on these kind of issues, climate columnist for The Independent and director of Climate Media Coalition. Afternoon to you both. I mean, Donnachadh, it's hard to find really another version of events for what happened in Newcastle. It's pretty obvious. It's like the air bubble effect. If you simply remove it from one area, it's going to pop up in another one. And that's what happened in Newcastle, so they've scrapped it. Ergo, they don't work.
Well, that's like saying one car broke down, all cars break down. I think it looks fairly fair to say that the Newcastle experiment didn't work, that it actually wasn't designed in a way that actually avoided traffic being transferred onto neighbouring residential roads, and they're right to review it. And that's what the process has been nationwide. You introduce them, you consult on them. If they work, you keep them. If they don't work, you remove them. If they need changes, you adjust them. But the vast majority of the LTNs that have been installed have been successful at making roads safer for kids going to school and reducing traffic, which is something we need in our cities. The domination of cars of our urban roads make kids cycling to school an endangered species, and that has had massive consequences for their health and their quality of life.
Sorry, did you say children are an endangered species? I'm sure that was a misspeak on your part, to be fair, Donnachadh.
I said children cycling to school is an endangered species.
All right, OK. Well, yeah, surely there's more.
In the UK, only 2% of them cycle to school, whereas in Holland, where they have low traffic neighbourhoods, and cycling is normal, 75%.
I was going to say, where there's loads of kids all over the place, you know, so they're everywhere, these things.
Yeah, well, they're endangered on bikes, unfortunately. OK,
but in terms of this idea that, I think this is the problem that people have, and I said at the beginning, you might not have heard the intro, that years ago, you know, they were Primrose Hill in the 1960s, they were doing this. Exeter in the 1970s had an urban renewal scheme. We've seen pedestrianisations of town centres. It's not in traffic calming measures, speed humps, narrowing roads, that kind of stuff. What I think, and I think a lot of people, you know, we moan about the traffic. We moan about the traffic, particularly if it's in our road. So it's almost as much as we moan about the weather. So I think most people understand there's a lot of traffic out there, but it's the idea that the consequences of driving down potentially your own road is that the state film you, photograph you, and send you a £100 fine. That's the bit that really bothers people, I think, Donnachadh.
Well, many schemes don't use that. For example, the low-traffic neighbourhood I live in, which has been one since we campaigned, there was a road going through our local park and then continued past our local school that was deadly. And so we campaigned for it to be traffic calmed, and they put in bollards, no fines, you just can't go through there. And so that has meant an absolute transformation of the community, both for disabled people and for local kids. And it has actually meant that now there is play streets taking place in the local community. They've started planting fruit trees in the neighbourhood, and it's actually extraordinary, the transformation that's happened as a result of that LTN that was installed 25 years ago.
Wow, sounds like the darling buds of May where you are. Sounds fantastic.
I love it.
Bob Bull, you represent drivers, of course. Drivers are the phrase that's always wheeled out there, perhaps not unreasonably. I'm sure Donnachadh will squirm at this one, is that drivers are the cash cow of Britain at the moment, and this is another example of it. Social mobility, something that freed the working man up to do his own thing, is now in a perilous position because the car is on its way out almost.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of the features of what seems to be going on in government and local governments at the moment to deter people from using cars. And I don't really understand it. As you just pointed out, it was probably one of the best things ever invented to give people the rights to travel, to go about their daily business and so on. And I don't see why certain people, particularly with certain views, should have the right to stop people travelling in the way that they feel they can.
Would you agree that we need to reduce traffic? I mean, there are areas, I mean, it's, as I was saying a second ago, Bob, it's a national conversation, isn't it? You know, there's too many cars, it takes me forever to get to work, and it would have been quicker to walk. You know, we hear that phrase a lot. So there's definitely an issue with the amount of cars.
Well, I think the amount of cars is one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is how many roads have been restricted. I mean, I could speak for Bristol, which is just outside. I live just outside of Bristol, and for years they've been shutting roads and making roads that were through roads dead end, and they've been doing that for years, many years.
So they've already been doing it, which, I mean, as we were saying there,
they've been forcing traffic onto other roads, and then they say those other roads are congested, and then they say that they're polluting. Well, they created it. You know, every time they build a roundabout, it doesn't take long before they've got traffic lights.
And that is one of the problems, isn't it, Donnachadh? If you look down where you live in London, you look at areas, and I was caught in a taxi on the embankment, which for those who don't know, runs right parallel with the Thames. Used to be quite a wide road. They've reduced it significantly to get a massive cycle lane in there. Very few cycles in there, by the way, but that's a whole other debate. And I was there midnight a few months back, bumper-to-bumper traffic from Westminster to Tower Bridge. That's no way to run a traffic system either, Donnachadh.
There's no way that traffic jam on the embankment was caused by one lane being removed for the cycle lane. And actually,
well, it didn't help because there would have been there's 50% less road.
Your point about the cycle lane is that actually it's one of the great successes in London. 3.5 million people use the first two cycle lanes, that one, the northwest and the east-west.
What percentage of people going to work ride a bike? 3.5 million people over what period of time?
3.5 people a year use those two cycle lanes. Actually, on Blackfriars Bridge, far more people are cycling into the City of London to work than are using cars or taxis. 50% of the traffic on Blackfriars Bridge now using that cycle lane is bikes. And something like 10,000 people can use a cycle lane per hour in central London.
But, you know, less than 1% of people ride a bike regularly, right, to work.
No, in central London.
It's a tiny amount of people, Donny.
Because they've put in the infrastructure in London.
It's always bloody raining apart from anything. Who wants to be on a bike when it's pouring hard?
Well, I'm sorry. Have you not ever heard of a raincoat and rain trousers, Ian? It's perfectly feasible to do so. But
I have to keep this high barnet in good shape. I can't be putting waterproof.
Well, I don't have that problem, as you can see.
This is very true. But, I mean, I think that the issue...
There's a serious point here, just to finish on that point, is that the transformation of travelling to central London, people don't use cars anymore, and thousands upon thousands are using cycles. And the Corporation of London is celebrating.
Well, hang on, Sadiq Khan seems to be thinking so many people are using cars that we're killing people because of cars.
In outer London?
Well, in inner London as well. There's also a congestion charge. There's a congestion charge. There's a ULEZ charge that was already there. So many cars that Sadiq Khan can't get enough of taxing cars.
Yeah, those steps were taken to help encourage people to stop using cars.
Yeah, worked a treat, didn't it?
Because, well, it's important, because what happens if 8 million people decide they want to drive into central London, and you'll never get there.
But you'd never get that amount of people who wanted to do that. Bob, I mean, this is, I assume from what you're hearing from Donnachadh there, this is, you know, for you, this is the kind of maligning of the motor car in action.
Well, of course, and the other problem is, and I think you need to ask people out in the real world, because London isn't part of the real world, the rest of the country having it imposed on it because London did something is ridiculous. There is absolutely no need in many towns for any sort of action with restricting cars travelling on certain roads. No need at all. So you've got a situation now in Newcastle where they're taking one out. You've got Birmingham's gone bust today. I wonder how much money they spent on trying to stop cars driving to Birmingham, whether they could have used that in a better way. And this is all over the place. People are spending thousands, if not millions of pounds on anti-car policies and structures and designs. In Bristol, they're making them up as they go. They're about to shut part of or they're planning to shut part of the main road out of Bristol to London, the A4. I mean, what on earth are they talking about?
Why would they want to shut the A4?
Good question. Because then they can make it just for buses and cyclists, and everybody will be happy and life will be wonderful.
Look, Donnachadh's face is lighting up at this term, buses and cyclists. It's like Christmas Day, Donnachadh, for you.
Well, I've no idea about what's happening on the A4, but I think actually one of the points...
You should get on your bike and have a look, I think.
Well, the A4 is quite a far way up to
yes.
Bristol. However, I think what's quite extraordinary in this conversation is this so-called war on motorists. I have never heard a bunch of victims and whingers when the reality is the opposite. 99% of the budget, transport budget, is not spent on cycling. It's a tiny less than 1%.
Because it's a tiny group of people that cycle, Donnachadh. And drivers it will always be. Look, the amount of people that cycle cycle are the same amount of people that play pool. It's that sort of terror. It's a minority thing, right? And that's fine, but it's a minority.
Not in London, because we've invested in making it. The surveys show a majority of people would like to be able to travel by bike or public transport or walk rather than using a car if the facilities are there for them. So we should invest in them. But the vast majority, something like £27 billion is being invested in the roads programme. The budget in for cycling is a tiny 50 million. It's a tiny 50 million.
Okay, but Bob, what were you going to say there?
Well, you talk about the amount of money spent on roads. How much money is spent by motorists in taxation? Billions. Way over the figure that you just quoted.
Yes, but you don't compensate for the impacts on people's health and on the climate and on quality of life and noise. Sorry, the health one's really important. If you look in the United Kingdom, something like 4.5 million people suffer from diabetes, 5.4 million suffer from asthma. The health consequence of our car culture
hang on a second. That's you're correlating people who happen to have a predicament where they have asthma, and you're correlating air pollution with car pollution here, Donnachadh. There is clearly in the Venn diagram an area to look at, but I mean air pollution is far wider than Matey in his Ford Fiesta. You've got to look at domestic air pollution. Posh areas where you live, Donnachadh, people with those lovely wood-burning stoves. I bet you've got one to fry your kumquats on. Those sort of areas.
Off the underground. Biggest pollution in London's from the underground.
Sorry, you're actually right, Ian, of course. Pollution comes from a number of different sources, but for most people in urban areas, one of the largest sources is transport pollution. And the issue of obesity is huge. Millions... In the UK, we have 3 times the level of obesity among our kids than we do in Holland, because they are terrified of cycling or walking to school. And this guy wants the right to drive down through every single child's street. He wants to put rat runs through our child's streets, and I don't understand why he hates children so much.
Bob, why do you hate children so much?
I don't. I've got to.
You like that bloke in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang with the net?
It's just rubbish. To talk about obesity being the result of cars is absolutely crackers. Absolutely crackers. People eat too much. Too many processed foods. What's that got to do with cars?
Exercise. Because people don't exercise anymore because they're afraid of going on the roads, because they're afraid
if you don't need to exercise, if you don't eat too much.
Well, I'm sorry, most people need to exercise to have a healthy heart and healthy
This is
life.
all quite statist stuff, Donnachadh, isn't it? You know, you want to have a kind of state-dictated exercise regime. You know, Chairman Mao used to say stuff like this. You know, this is very, very up there, isn't it, with left-wing thinking. You want the state to say you've got to get on a bike, you've got to do your 20 minutes a day, you've got to do X, Y, Z in order to get fit and not pollute anybody, etc. I mean, we live in a technological world, an industrial world. There is pollution around, but there's a trade-off with that, isn't there? Most people by a country mile aren't going to die of pollution. It's something people live with in all sorts of ways. If you went to another planet and started from scratch, there'd be some pollution there.
Well, the point about jumping from actually for the state providing infrastructure both for cyclists and drivers and pedestrians to say state enforcement, I think is a big jump, Ian. I'm actually wanting to enable people to do it if they choose and wish to do so. And when you do it in London, people have turned up. It's been really successful. And the studies of the low traffic neighbourhoods has been really positive, except for this one. Obviously, as I say, some work, some don't. But the studies of the 10 in London that was produced last year in the Journal of Transport said they were a success in reducing people's use of car use and facilitating safer routes for kids.
So do you think, Donnachadh, that people who were affected by specifically those 10 areas that you mentioned, do you sense then that those people, a percentage of those people, literally ditched their cars and started cycling?
All I know is that the stats said 6% of car usage went down in those areas, and the actual amount of traffic through there has collapsed. But the most important figure that came out of it was that up to 70% reduction in crashes. That's the key stat.
There it is, Bob. What's not to like?
Well, it's a magic question, that, isn't it? 6% reduction in traffic and 70% reduction in accidents. How the hell did you figure that one out? It obviously wasn't the cars that were causing the accidents.
Sorry, that's rather illogical. Car crashes cause car crashes. There's nothing I can say about that.
But if you reduce the traffic by 6% and you reduce the accidents by 70%, it clearly wasn't the fact that cars were travelling through the area that were causing accidents.
Unless 6% of cars were responsible for 70% of accidents.
No,
well, that's a possibility, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I doubt that too, Donnachadh. Come on, you fiddling around with the stats again.
No, I'm not. I'm happy to look at the figures. Imperial College, the up to 7% reduction in crashes.
That's the college that keeps in business, isn't it? Yeah, they're going to be very much pro-car, I'm sure.
There it is. Listen, gentlemen, we stop there for no other reason than I'm Donnachadh McCarthy, climate columnist at The Independent, and Bob Bull, chairman of the Alliance of British Drivers.